Hello and welcome to another episode of the Dead Ink Bookshop podcast. A few weeks ago we hosted a conversation between three scholars of pop culture. There was Tim Worthington, the TV expert and author of the new book The Golden Age of Children's TV, Justin Lewis, author of the musical almanac Don't Stop the Music, which is a compendium of notable dates and fascinating trivia from the world of pop music, and Andy Miller was asking the questions. Andy is the co-host of the literary podcast Backlisted and author of The Year of Reading Dangerously. It was a really funny and fascinating conversation that our recording equipment completely failed to capture. So last week, Tim and Andy returned to the bookshop. Very sadly, Justin was not able to join us on this occasion, and we delved once more into Tim's incredibly rich and detailed history of children's television.
Hello everybody, well thanks for listening to this podcast. I'm really pleased to be joined here today, not just by Michael, whose voice you'll have just heard via the miracle of technology recorded at another point, but most importantly with our friend Tim Worthington, who is the author of several books, including, most recently, The Golden Age of Children's TV, a nostalgic look at brilliant British telly! Tim, in the words of Alan Partridge, what's that all about then?
Well, it's not got much Alan Partridge in it for a start, but
Okay.
although that is a good tagline, brilliant British telly, it is important that not everything in here is brilliant. There are, dull sort of children's BBC costume dramas. There's Why Don't You, which people's mileage might very much vary on, but the point is that it's the story of children's TV, basically from the launch of ITV. There's a little bit about the BBC before that, up to the white paper on the future of broadcasting in 1989, which is really... It is a coincidence that that's when things change, because you get a new generation of programme makers coming in who've grown up watching TV, whereas everyone before that came to the theatre or radio or cinema or all kinds of other disciplines, and they didn't quite know what they were doing, and quite often created, as people will say, well, people use the word magical a lot about things like Bagpuss. I'm not sure I'd choose a more imaginative way of describing things myself, but they sometimes did that. They sometimes did terrifying things, sometimes did boring things, sometimes did things that didn't work for all kinds of reasons. And it is much more fascinating than people generally tend to assume. And also it is a story. It is a story that starts when, there'd only be one television station up until the mid-50s. Suddenly there's a rival, a commercially funded rival as well. And the BBC have to react to that without fundamentally changing what they're doing. And meanwhile, ITV are trying to grab viewers away. Things change as the 60s come along, and the Beatles arrive, and the pop art movement, and technology is available for people to start making their own programmes, which is how you get people like Oliver Postgate and Peter Furman. And then in the 70s, industrial relations play a large part of it, and in the 80s, things start to change. Home videos come along, and like I say, there are people coming in. You see the decade out with Press Gang, and Stephen Moffat is somebody who clearly, the first television series he'd ever written, and he was somebody who was only informed by television series he'd watched in that case.
Press Gang ran from when to when, remind me?
That was, I think, 89 to 93.
And was it produced by a children's department within who? Granada? No.
It was Central.
Yeah, okay.
And it was... Actually, Richmond Films were an independent film production company, but it was a production for children's ITV.
So, you cover a specific period of time. We'll come on to what constitutes ideas of a golden age, but I do want to pick you up on this thing about brilliant British telly ! I suspect that's not your subtitle. You don't have to commit either way, right? But brilliant British telly. Now, you mentioned Why Don't You there. For anyone who doesn't remember Why Don't You, it's interesting you picked that, because I, as a child, very much resented the central message of Why Don't You, which is, why don't you stop watching this television set? Right?
Yes.
The television set is my friend. Why are you negging me, as they would say in the world of the pickup artist? Is it to get me to love you more? So when you are a child, right? how much did you like TV? It's such a ridiculous question to ask you, Tim, because you know so much about it and you're still so animated by it. But when you were a child, how much did you like TV?
I think it's, well, I'm going to say what is interesting is I think I found it interesting more than I actually enjoyed watching programmes, because I remember thinking very early on about things like sort of realising one day that Brian Cant, the man who was on Play School, was the voice on Camberwick Green, Trumpton and Chigley. I remember trying to think, not really having any concept of time, but trying to think, how did he do both of them? Because it didn't make any sense to me. I remember tying that in with seeing a bit of, I think I managed to work out, it was a BBC showing of A Now for Something Completely Different, the first Monty Python film, and my dad was watching it, and he remembers this better than I do, but there was an instant where I was very puzzled to say, that's John Cleese who's in Fawlty Towers. And I don't think I'd actually seen Fawlty Towers. I think it had been mentioned on Swap Shop or something, and they'd maybe had him or Andrew Sachs as a guest. So I was aware that, you know, this man was in two different things, and how does it make sense? A bit like it took me a while to get my head around the fact Paul McCartney did Mull of Kintyre was also in the Beatles, who were in the, as mentioned in the cartoon that I watched quite a lot before I started school, because it used to be on Granada in the daytime.
Well, the American Beatles cartoon from the 1960s.
Yes, the one where they supposedly have British accents, but
they have British accents, and their episodes they chase around after characters called Penny Lane, and you know. And the thing can I just say, Tim, I would have envied you greatly as a child, because you're going to correct me, I don't remember those Beatles cartoons being shown in the London and the South East regions. So you clearly got them up here. We're recording in Liverpool, and we didn't. I would have killed to see those.
Well, that's another, just to sidetrack slightly, another sort of facet to the story in the book, which does sort of end. I mean, the ITV regions go on for a couple of years, but ITV used to be split up by region, and there were different. I mean, the BBC was to an extent, because you have BBC Bristol, BBC Pebble Mill, and so on, that did, to a limited extent, have their own programmes. But ITV, it was almost like you had a different broadcaster depending on where you lived, and they would largely, outside of a core set of hours, show whatever they wanted, whenever they wanted. Recounted in the book, there was an incident where, I mean, Granada seems to have had the most eccentric scheduling approach in the world, but they did one afternoon show an American horror TV movie called Bad Ronald, which I saw, I think, when I was 5, about a boy who accidentally murders a classmate, and his mother hides him in the crawl space. I remember it so vividly, but like, Granada obviously thought, well, we own the Beatles, we do here, and they put the Beatles cartoon on constantly. And
wow, okay,
like I think there were some regions that never showed it, because apparently I think it was shown in a couple of regions in the 60s, but not really. I think Brian Epstein might have tried to block it over here, actually.
Oh, that's a good
I'm
fact.
no Mark Lewison, I'm no sort of ultimate Beatles expert, but I think something like that happened.
Okay, that's very interesting. Perhaps Brian could only block it in LWT for some reason. I don't know. I don't know why. Now listen, and yet somehow, as you're talking about the ITV regions, I grew up watching Thames TV in the weekdays and London Weekend Television at the weekends, and yet somehow, even though there was no internet, much like the tree that falls in the forest, yet we know about it, I was aware that somewhere in the country, Gus Honeybun was reading out best birthday wishes. How did I know that? I don't know. We didn't get Tiswas for years either. And you write about Tiswas a lot. So as a kid, let me ask you, we've talked about you were fascinated by TV. Did you prefer Multicoloured Swap Shop to Tiswas? Or were you an equal opportunities viewer?
My recollection is that in our household we watched both, and you would switch between the two as and when, quote, the boring bits came up. When poor old John Craven said, let's have a look at some of Britain's disappearing wildlife, it was straight over to Tiswas. And then when there was some really boring band that you'd never heard of, you know, God love them, but a lot of the mod revival bands in the early 80s were not good at interviews. And, you know, then it'd be straight over to Swap Shop and, oh, look, Hong Kong Phooey's about to start. So, but I think if I had to pick one, I would say Swap Shop, because Noel quite often wandered off set. I think maybe, you know, a filmed item had failed to show up or something, and said, you know, let's have a look at what the Backroom Boys are doing and how they make my voice go over the clock.
Well, that's why we've got Michael here, isn't it? I said we're trying to evoke the spirit of Kenny Everett's laughing cameraman.
I'm waiting for you to mention a programme that I've heard of. I'm about
You're
10
just
years
too young,
for this
aren't you?
conversation,
Yeah.
I'm afraid.
Oh,
Yeah,
yeah. Don't believe him, listeners.
You do remember Press Gang, surely?
I remember Press Gang being on, but despite it being kind of kids' TV, I remember thinking, oh, that's a bit grown up for me. Children's Ward would have been more my speed at that era.
I don't even know what Children's Ward is.
It was like Biker Grove on a children's ward in a hospital, basically.
It came out of an episode of, you must remember Dramarama, which again, ITV Regions, it was a series where each region would do a different sort of drama serial, one-off, so not serial obviously, but I am going somewhere with that. They do a different one-off per series, and most of them were thinking, because quite a few children's ITV shows came out of that, and one of them was Granada did, I think it was called Blackbird Singing in the Dead of Night, which somehow they had Blackbird by the Beatles playing over the end credits. I don't know how they got away with that, but that then became Children's Ward. I think Kay Mellor was the first sort of lead writer for that, but later Russell T Davies, one of his earliest gigs was Children's Ward.
I was just about to say that. I thought I've got a good fact here. I got picked.
So you got if you don't get it in quick,
and he also took over Why Don't You towards the end and tried to make it Russell. He tried to make it more.
Davies took over Why Don't You?
He tried to make it more zany, and he brought in sort of surreal running storylines and had recurring, because it had different, BBC regions, different regional gangs doing it each week,
right?
And he had some that moved between the regions to provide some continuity.
Wait, so there was like multiple versions of Why Don't You running simultaneously?
Well, no, it'd be 1 week at a time.
Oh, right, sorry. I think
that's where they got the idea for the multiverse from.
Sorry.
Yes.
You meant everyone, like the regional news, everyone had their own Why Don't You. Sorry. I'm sure it was like
the Dublin Gang Infinity War.
Yeah. So you're talking there about, let's go back to the Swap Shop and Tiswas, because you do write about this extensively in your book. You were talking there about Noel would sometimes, you were fascinated by TV, therefore Swap Shop offered you the sense that it was in a TV studio. There would be stuff that was shown with the Backroom Boys. We're recording this in a back room now, and that's the kind of spirit we want to evoke, right? And I wondered if you could tell people what the genesis of those two shows was and why they were unusual.
They both came out of people just trying to fill time on air, really.
Right.
With Tiswas, it was a couple of the announcers were, they had to link, because ITV didn't really put any thought on Saturday mornings at that point. They used to show, I think, the Johnny Weissmuller Tarzan films and a couple of Looney Tunes cartoons, and different ITV regions did different things. Like Granada, we sometimes had in-vision announcers, we sometimes didn't. But ATV, where Tiswas came from, they always had in-vision announcers, one of whom was Chris Tarrant, although he wasn't involved until a little while into Tiswas, when it initially was just the announcers just doing ridiculous things between programmes, because they thought the kids are going to be bored by this, so they made up stupid competitions, chucked water over each other and so on. They were trying to have a laugh with the audience, and then it just kept getting bigger and bigger. Eventually it became a strand, taking in what they were showing. It basically became the whole show, which is why you'd still got Tiswas interrupted by old Tarzan films and so on.
Okay, and Tiswas, for our many younger listeners, Tiswas, the letters Tiswas are an acronym standing for...
It varied, but it was mostly Today is Saturday, Watch and Smile. Although it sometimes wear a smile.
Never knew that.
Did you not know
that?
No.
Was he Tiswas?
No. Noel Edmonds was he Tiswas.
Didn't he do like a Saturday morning thing?
He did. It was called the Multicoloured Swap Shop.
Oh,
it was the other one.
Right, sorry.
And in fact, Tim knows what a Multicoloured Swap Shop is an acronym for. So, no, it isn't. It isn't, no.
I think it was John Craven's Multicoloured Jumpers.
That's right. Okay, so basically what you're saying is Tiswas evolves organically. Right, so it goes from being a selection of programmes just to fill space on a Saturday morning, but gradually they realise that they've got a kind of identity around this thing, and it becomes a strand. Now, tell me, was Swap Shop a reaction to that idea?
Not really. No, it was a sort of weird combination of they've been trying to do, because Radio 1 at that point in 1976 was still new in inverted commas. It had only launched in 1967.
It's only 9 years.
And, you know, they tried, most of the DJs wanted the big gigs on TV. You know, they all wanted Top of the Pops, they wanted to do adult programmes. Noel Edmonds had been doing The Breakfast Show since 1970. I think he took over when Kenny Everett was famously fired for making a joke about the transport minister's wife passing a driving test, and he said she probably crammed a fiver in the examiner's hand, and he got fired, and Noel Edmonds took over, as Stuart Lee once put it, because he had a beard. But he was different. He seemed to want to be, he was more interested in children's TV, and they tried a couple of things with him, because don't forget, his first TV gig, I think, was presenting Come Dancing, which is a very, very weird fit for him. Yeah, but Children's BBC tried him in a couple of things, and they had a live show called Z Shed, where ostensibly it was during the regular children's schedule, but you phoned in with your problems, you know, and said, my geography teacher's giving us too much homework, and you say, do you get too much homework? Phone in and tell us what you think. And they liked, the show itself didn't work, but they liked Noel's interaction with the live audience, and the idea of kids phoning in. And they suddenly started thinking, well, we could do something that's a bit like him being on the radio, but on TV. On the Saturday morning, and at that point, famously Keith Chegwin, who was his sidekick, who, you know, he used to good-naturedly bully on air, I would say. I think Noel actually probably came up with the name Cheggers, you know, it was a kind of keeping him in this place thing. Yeah. But he had, because he was a child actor, and he wrote to the BBC Children's Department saying, hello, I'm really good and I've got lots of ideas, can I come in and talk?
I've got a fact before anyone else
please
do
it.
Keith Chegwin is in Roman Polanski's Macbeth.
He is,
I believe.
Yes.
He is,
yeah.
Yes. What a swap he organised. No, but the thing about Keith Chegwin was a child actor, wasn't he? Wasn't he in one of the, like a Children's Film Foundation, Robin Hood
Jr., yes.
Yes, thank you.
And he'd done some pop singles as well, as had Sally James, his kind of equivalent of his was. But basically they just thought, well, we've got this thing coming up, he sounds like he's cheeky enough to handle, you know, outside broadcasts. Yeah. And apparently they had one interview with him and they said, that's it, you're the co-host of Swap Shop. And
wow.
It just sort of came together from nowhere, really.
I mean, Michael, I went to the sort of school where we had Wednesday afternoons off, so they could cram in more sports fixtures. But as a result, which I had to go to school on Saturday mornings. So for me, Swap Shop, my memories of Swap Shop are not purely nostalgic; they're almost phantom ones.
So
because I wanted to watch it terribly. It seemed to me the most hilarious, exciting, exactly for the reason Tim said, actually, sort of behind the scenes programme where you could see the groups that you liked and there were good cartoons. And also Noel Edmonds was really good. This is the thing we forget about Noel Edmonds. He was very good at that stuff, right?
And they would have the cooler bands on Swap Shops. Well, depending on your point of view, but Tiswas went for, you know, the punks, the anarchy, bad manners, people like that. Status Quo were on it quite a lot because they didn't object to being hit with custard pies. And, you know, in fact, there's a brilliant clip where you see Phil Collins playing who Genesis were not the most humorous band in the world, but he's playing a flower in the sketch of Lenny Henry doing this David Bellamy impression. So, you know, that was that. But you get people like Blondie and XTC and New Music on Swap Shop.
And the members of ABBA, of course.
And they always show that
famously,
clip of Depeche Mode, which I think Depeche Mode not very keen on, but their first TV was Swap Shop.
Was it really?
Yeah.
I remember in 1979 watching an interview with Debbie Harry and Chris Stein from Blondie, and I can actually, this is one I definitely did watch. It must have been in the holidays, so I got to see it. And I can remember them being what I thought to myself, why? They're drawling quite a lot, and they seem quite, they've got dark glasses on, and they seem quite tired. They seem quite tired, the people from Blondie. Only later did I realise they were probably very much the worse for wear on something or other by that point. But as you suggest, Tim, the idea that pop stars that famous would just pop up on TV on the phone was really compelling if you were a kid and you were a pop fan. Another one, I'll give you one more, Tim, maybe you remember this too. You don't write so much about Doctor Who in this book.
That's a deliberate decision, but if
We'll
you
come
want,
on to
we'll
that.
come back to
We'll
that.
come
yeah.
on to it in a minute. I absolutely remember early on in Tom Baker's run as the Fourth Doctor. So we're talking about maybe in the mid-70s. He appeared on Multicoloured Swap Shop, and and on Monday at school, everyone was going, "Did you see the guy who plays Doctor Who on Swap Shop? He was absolutely so weird." Which in turn then enhanced my enjoyment of Doctor Who, because I thought, okay, that's actors acting, but he's also not acting. That's his personality.
Well, it was, because, again, slight diversion, but he also presented a series that do talk about some length in there called The Book Tower, where I don't know who thought it was supposed to get kids reading. You know, it did appeal to kids like me, but it was shot at a very frightening looking stately home. It had Andrew Lloyd Webber did the theme music, which he'd clearly been to The Exorcist not long before it. And then you had Tom Baker going, "Hello, do you enjoy being frightened by stories about Bronze Age men?" And the funny thing is, around the same time, he did BBC Two's Late Night Story for a week, I think in the Christmas week of 1978, where he was reading out horror stories. And it's genuinely, if you can... Those are on one of the Doctor Who DVDs. Do not watch them last thing at night. But it's exactly the same as the Book Tower. There is no difference between the two. So who thought the Book Tower was suitable for children?
I love the Book Tower, as not terribly surprising to learn. The Book Tower was a series that ran on ITV through to about the mid-80s, and it parallels Doctor Who in as much as it starts off with the commanding figure of Tom Baker presenting it, and it ends with the Sylvester McCoy-like figure of Timmy Mallet presenting it instead. Now I know we have rediscovered Sylvester's run as Doctor Who, and it's been reappraised.
I think we need to rediscover it. I always liked that.
That has yet to happen to Timmy Mallet's run on the Book Tower, but I don't know.
Maybe the Book Tower, but I always bring this up about Timmy Mallet for, as much as people might have found him, his approach irritating, or I'm not saying I always was prepared for his jollity first thing in the morning, but have you ever seen the report he did from South Africa for the Wide Awake Club?
No.
Where he kind of explains apartheid in sort of kid-friendly senses and says, if you've got some friends at school and they're black, they won't be allowed to play football with you, they won't be allowed to do this. And he just looks into the camera and says, it's not fair, is it? And that I think that needs to be his legacy, really, not just going whacka, 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 whacka and hitting himself with a big rubber mallet.
Timmy Mallet's one of the first things you mentioned I've got real clear memories of as a kid. I used to love Timmy Mallet, and it was more for his hitting people with an inflatable hammer than his hard hitting.
Of course, and his reports from the Iraq War were quite something. Okay, so listeners, Tim is a delight to interview because every thought sparks another thought, right? We're going to go back one more time to Swap Shop and one more time to Tiswas. Was there a sense in the 70s that perhaps there hadn't been before, that children needed more playfulness on TV than there had previously been the case? Children's TV seems up to that point to be quite a paternalistic or maternalistic thing, pedagogic. It's a teaching medium. We inform, we entertain, Reithian principles. Tiswas certainly has much less of that, and I think Swap Shop does as well. And as you say, if you could bounce forwards and backwards between the two, you could avoid any improving content whatsoever.
Yes, I think that's true. I mean, it hadn't occurred to me till now, but one of the first children's programmes shown in the 70s was Here Come the Double Deckers, which I think is a real watershed moment. And that's the start of... I mean, The Goodies starts a couple of months later, and as much as, the Goodies were influenced by the Monkees, I think let's see Here Come the Double Deckers as well. And then you start getting things like Rent-A-Ghost and, more open-minded children's dramas and so on. I do think it is that maybe there was less control over. I mean, there were people trying. There's a producer called Paul Ciani who was forever trying to get Saturday morning shows going in the late 60s. He did very odd things like whoosh exclamation mark and Zocco exclamation mark, which
You're right, they sound amazing in the
they
book.
are incredible. I mean, there are some clips from some of them on various online video sites, and they really are. I'm sure kids who watched them at the time, you know, it would have fitted in with the whole Sergeant Pepper, Terry Gilliam, cut-out animation sort of mood, but they look absolutely mind-blowing now.
Yeah.
Even in black and white, they assault your senses.
Yeah. You were talking about Here Come the Double Deckers. Was the Double Deckers... Okay, so the 56-year-old man attempts to spray-see the Double Deckers. So the Double Deckers were a gang who lived on a stationary London double-decker bus, right?
Yeah.
And they had adventures, and they sang songs, very much in the mode of the Monkees or early series of Scooby-Doo, Where Are You?
Yeah.
Right? And Melvin Hayes occasionally popped up, didn't he?
As the conductor of the stationary bus, which I never quite understood.
Yeah, I mean, and one of the members of Aswad was a double-decker,
Yes,
correct?
that's really important. Brinsley Ford, who does show up in a lot of children's shows in the 70s, including, completely counter to what I'm going to say, he's in a brilliant series, which not all of it exists now, called The Georgian House, where it's about some children who are doing kind of work experience with the National Trust, and they end up back in time where he's a slave in the sort of the property they're working in, and it's all about should they be trying to liberate him or should they let history take its course. But in Here Come the Double Deckers, he is just one of the gang.
Yeah,
Ironically,
right.
if you look, that's now
Right.
the only problem would be the fact there was an obese boy that they called Donut who was always eating. I think that's what people would have an issue with now.
The Donut, yes, he's called Donut. It's not good.
Nothing about Brinsley Ford's character is in
that's
any way
interesting,
an issue now.
And also, Peter
Firth.
Peter Firth was in it,
Yes.
was he not? Later to become famous as Harry in Spooks. As a child actor, he's
like
Here Come the Double Deckers.
the boss.
Yeah.
Oh, right.
He brings all the gravitas to the double deckers that was required. But okay, so how did here's a thing you talk about a lot in the book, and the double deckers is an example of it. How many episodes of the double deckers are there?
There are, I think there's 13 of that.
Just 13. And yet I feel like it ran for years. And was it made independently and then pitched to one of the terrestrial
Yeah, it was
channels?
20th Century Fox, yeah.
Okay, so it's done as a film, and presumably it's commissioned, is it in the late 60s?
Yeah, it would have been.
So there's a kind of residual swinging London
Yes,
thing.
yeah.
Right, okay, how interesting. Because none of that, we didn't realise any of that when we were kids.
No.
It was just on, and then it was on again,
And
then it was on
didn't
again.
feel like it was from, a while back.
Yeah.
Even, when I would it would have been, pushing a decade old, but it didn't feel like the Monkees didn't feel to me
Yeah.
like they were from another age.
Yeah.
I remember actually trying to think, are they from now or are they from when the Beatles were?
I contend, quite seriously, that many of the pop groups of our generation, certainly mine, for instance, I always think Saint Etienne is a very good example of this. How they conduct themselves as pop groups is informed more by the Monkees than it is by real pop groups. If
Yeah.
you grew up thinking everybody lived in a house together and had adventures and didn't even need to plug their guitars in, the real rock and roll kind of slightly disappoints thereafter.
Where does the Monkees TV series and the film Help? Which was first there?
I think Help was in production at the same time as the Monkees because it was a Hard Day's Night they were trying to do on TV. And I think the Monkees you're going to get letters about this, but I think it's lasted slightly better than Help. I think it's got more variety in it. There are less problematic elements, shall we say, but
In the Monkees.
yeah, with the caveat that I
okay.
do think about the Beatles, and I also think about the Goodies and Monty Python, it's because they're so absolutely bang on the money, right on 99% of the time, that the one or two bits that don't work, like Graham Chapman's director and so on, stand out a mile.
Yeah.
And with the Beatles, it's, John occasionally does what can only be described as Peter Sellers accents because he spends most of his time arguing against things like that. That's the reason it's noticed. But I think the Monkees it's a little bit more progressive than, because it was kind of under the counterculture.
I don't know, Tim. I know what you mean, but on the other
You're going
hand,
to bring up something I've forgotten now.
No, but it was a trope of the Monkees TV series that there would be a Mexican bandito,
True,
yes, or a Russian spy, or a Chinese whatever. I'm not sure those were always treated as sensitively as they might have been.
I was thinking more of they only did the 8 million episodes where they befriend an old inventor who's lost his job.
if only they'd stuck to those. But returning to this idea that there were only 13 episodes of the Double Deckers, can you give us a few examples of TV series that we might think ran for several seasons, where in fact we just see the same 7, 8, 10 episodes again and again and again?
Yes, Bagpuss, Camberwick Green, Trubden and Chigley, Mr. Ben. It tends to be sort of the children's lunchtime shows because...
Yeah, Mr. Ben's just like 10 or 12, isn't it?
That's in fact it's 13. I think it's only 8 of them on the wheel at start as well, which is even less reason to think there's millions of them.
Write in, listeners, if you can name the 5 missing costumes on Mr. Ben, on the opening credits of Mr.
Well,
Ben.
he never used the Napoleon costume that was in the window of the costume shop. That used to really bug me. I saw that one. And also, why was never a Bagpuss about the toy train that's next to him when he wakes up?
Well, was that from the scrapped season 2 that never got made? But so this idea that series were made in limited runs. So there are, as you famously you are referred to yourself as quote unquote TV's Clangers expert. Were there 2 series? There were 2 series of the Clangers, weren't there? And was the second series the result of the success of the first, or didn't it work like that?
It's very hard because there's so many contradictory versions of events of all things of small films and their productions.
Mm-hmm.
Like Oliver Postgate's and Peter Furman's recollections never quite seem to tally with each other, but they never really commented on, because there was a second series of Pogle's Wood as well. I think that was possibly the only one. There might have been technically 2 runs of Ivor the Engine back in the late 50s,
right.
But I think it was really just because they felt there was more, story to it. Whereas I imagine with Bagpuss, you probably run out what you could do by 13. But with the Clangers, you just got a planet where things keep landing on it, and you can do anything there. And then you can do, which you didn't mention, 2 years later, an election special.
Yeah, do you want to tell us what? Do you want to tell us a bit about the Clangers election special? Because this is a real thing.
Yes,
this is Tim's attempt, following Timmy Mallet, to politicise the content of much loved children's TV.
In this case, it was not me politicising it. There were 2 general elections in 1974 for reasons that are too boring to go into now. But it's fascinating the effect that had on television. I think there were people like Mike Yarwood's special had to be held back for 6 months or something because his impressions were constituted, undue influence over the impending second general election. And as you guys will both be familiar with, there's that Monty Python 4-minute plus sketch opening an episode with the choreographed party political broadcast that disappeared for nearly 50 years because they had to edit it out with the repeat that year and then forgot where they put the full version. And it's in the script book, but everyone was like, I've never seen that. And then now it's been restored. But in amongst the various attempts of, because John Craven's newsround was going by then, so John Craven would have tried to explain why there were 2 elections, but Oliver Postgate was asked to do a new Clangers, sort of explaining...
What year are we in now?
74 this is, explaining how elections worked. And the Clangers and the Froglets and the Soup Dragon as well are not very happy with him trying to get them to establish democratic order on their planet. They're quite happy with things working the way they are.
Does a Clanger say, it isn't fair?
It sounds like the Soup Dragon says "sod off" at the end of it, directly to Oliver Postgate. I don't think that's a coincidence, because the original scripts do have mild swearing in them.
And so was this broadcast how many times, that election special?
I think the legend was it was only once. I'm fairly certain I found a second broadcast of it, possibly the following year, but then obviously that then wasn't seen until, I think it may have been, I got a clip of it into a documentary on BBC 4 in about 2009, and apparently a new copy had to be struck from the BBC's film library at Windmill Road for it, because it just hadn't been, and wasn't until the Blu-ray came out that it was really available in full.
Wow. So let's return to this idea. Michael, do you remember a world where you couldn't watch a television programme when you wanted to?
Yeah, this is actually something I was going to bring up and ask about, because you said you're a huge TV fan when you were a kid, sort of doesn't take that much more time out of your schedule than being any other kid. You're just kind of enjoying that time more because there's such a limited window in the schedules. And I feel like when a kid tells me now they really like TV, what they mean is they like sitting in front of the TV for a long period of time as an activity, whereas what you're talking about is loving the individual pieces of content and sort of obsessing over them. So it just strikes me as a very different way of but yeah, one of my first kids' TV memories, I was obsessed since I could remember with Indiana Jones. I just thought this idea of like a history teacher who's a cool guy with a whip at the weekend running off with all these women and things that he's found in the ground. It was brilliant. And then
is that why you now fight crime when you're not running?
Well, of course, yeah.
The bookshop.
That's why when you don't see me, I've got a ridiculous hat on and a leather jacket. But there was two kind of Indiana Jones knockoff kids TV series on in rival slots, matching slots in the 90s.
Go on.
Well, can you remember who played the two characters?
Well, I'm trying to think if one of the rival was Tales of the Golden Monkey. Was that
That was early 80s.
Was it? Yeah. Do you remember that?
That was sort of the nationwide slot after the cancelled nationwide.
That's right. Anyway, no, I don't.
That was a direct rip-off.
The one I chose to focus on, I think we were a bit of a BBC house. My parents were, watching ITV. Uncle Jack and Operation Green. Uncle Jack being played by Paul Jones from Manfred Mann, which ran for 4 series. Paul Jones and his niece and nephew, Kate and Michael, would investigate like a different. It was kind of ecologically themed, and his sort of Blofeld recurring villain was a woman called the Vixen. But this meant that
it was like the Beatles cartoon as well. So they'd like be chasing a pretty flamingo in one episode.
But this meant I had to miss the ITV one, which I think, if I remember correctly, was called like Jackson Pace or Jackson
Pace the Great Years.
That's it, right? Yeah. So I'd see these adverts, and this looks like the coolest thing. He's got the leather jacket. My big thing was swinging across holes on a rope, because you could do that in school with the gymnasium ropes. So for years I was trying to find this online, and it turned up on YouTube about a handful of years ago, 3 or 4 years ago. So I was able to see it for the first time since glimpsing just adverts of it. And it turns out that this guy who's been in my head as like the epitome of cool for 30 years is played by
Keith Allen.
With quite long hair. Yeah, it's a really... Now, having seen Keith Allen's subsequent career, it's quite bizarre to see him playing this like swashbuckling hero.
But you didn't... This was not a show... I suppose what I'm wondering is, was this a show that you didn't tape?
Yeah, basically I missed it, so I missed it for 30 years.
Exactly. So this is what I'm saying. Tim, do you think our memories of the programmes we watched as children, one reason why we got to see things multiple times was we couldn't record them, and either they were shown repeatedly by the TV channels, or else you did only see them once? And is that why they... Is that why they formed the basis of conversations from our student years to our adulthood to right now? Because they're so vivid to us.
Absolutely. I think you value... Because there was less on the one hand, there was less stuff available to you, and also there was less stuff to remember. And this will become relevant in a minute. But one of my favourite series the last couple of years is Community, the sitcom, and I've rewatched that in full a couple of times, and every time I think I don't remember this episode at all. And yet, the two examples I'll point to would be the Ghosts of Motley Hall when that came out on DVD, because it was like the more serious Rent-A-Ghost, where basically some ghosts who were resident in an abandoned stately home that was forever on the verge of being knocked down. They were terrified what will happen to us if the building we haunted isn't there anymore.
It was BBC TV's Ghosts.
Yes,
Avant la lettre.
Yeah. Basically, and the effects in it are really good when you watch it now. You can't tell they're being superimposed, into a set to make it look like Freddie Jones. I think the cast's incredible. Sheila Stiefel as well. But when I watched series 1 of that, every single one, and I've not seen it since it was on, and when it was on, I was incredibly young. I was probably only watching it because my elder siblings were watching it. I don't know if I'd necessarily would have seen it otherwise, but each one I was thinking, oh, this is the one where.
Right.
And, I'd remembered all them without realising, but also the BBC Sunday Classic slot, obviously on the Sunday, where they did sort of family-friendly, but sort of child-skewed adaptations like Great Expectations and so on. In 1978, they did Pinocchio, but they did it based on the actual source novel. And legend has it, I was so terrified by it because it's screechy, there's a lot of violence towards there's an actual puppet with human actors, and it's a really sort of rough, splintery puppet, and it's got quite scary music that I refused to watch after the third episode or something. But when I got hold of that, mainly, as research for this, watching it, I just thought, I remember every detail of this. I remember, because when the Blue Fairy comes in, how they did the Blue Fairy. I remember the things he said when he talked back to Geppetto, the things he said, and it was quite astonishing that I remembered these. I deliberately hadn't tried to remember Pinocchio in that case. I tried to forget about it, but that I had that vivid a recall of things that I had only seen once a very long time ago.
I think one of the things about I always feel various generations have different defining media. They have the thing that they're the first generation to truly experience. So we could say baby boomers experience pop music in a way that people haven't before, and perhaps millennials experience the internet in a way that they're the first generation that grow up with the internet. But you and me, Tim, as the poor cursed members of Generation X, TV was our thing.
Yep, and again, I think our childhood coincides with basic television. Hadn't been that available prior to the early to mid 70s. There were, well, I say there were 3 channels. There were 2 channels for, the first half of the 60s. Not everyone could get the second channel until around 1970. I think that was when the rollout completed. And it was barely on as well. A couple of hours a day, both channels. I vividly remember being up before TV, in the school holidays, and there was nothing on. And then eventually there'd be, the test card on the BBC. Although there's odd little films used to show in the ITV regions where you'd see, like a kind of a Yorkshire TV van on its way to, the Yorkshire TV studios, and the bloke with big headphones on, like pointing at one of those red light bulbs in a cage, saying transmission on.
Now, one thing that was a fixture of our childhoods, therefore, is on the front of your book. And it is, you mentioned it there, it's the test card.
Yeah.
I'm going to ask Michael, do you actually remember that being on TV?
Yeah.
Just about?
Distantly, like early 90s sort of thing.
Right. Tim, give us a potted history of the test card, because
actually, I will say
in here is amazing.
Part of the reason why I probably have such a strong memory of it is because of people from your generation talking about it a lot and keeping that memory alive. 'Cause that was very frequently discussed on Not BBC and whatnot, wasn't it?
It's become a folk memory, is what you're
exactly.
saying. Okay.
And it was something that people used for, if something had broken down, they put up the test card, which wasn't technically what the test card was used for.
Yeah, I think the Alan and Joe DVD menus based on it and stuff like that.
All right, well, I'm going to ask Michael to describe what he sees on the test card.
Okay, there's a circle in the center of a frame. The frame around it features geometric designs in black and white and colors, presumably to test the various capacities of your TV. Within the circle, there is a girl midway through. Is she playing noughts and crosses with a ghost? And there's a horrible puppet of a clown with no arms or legs sitting next to her. And she looks like she's getting away with something.
Yes, she always looked like she knew something you didn't, because I was quite frightened of the test card when I was young.
Thinking...
And I think people thought it was, I didn't like the clown, but it was more the girl looking at you. I really didn't like that. And it would have either a continuous, I found out it's 440 hertz tone, or it would have very tuneless big band music with, wonky saxophone versions of All My Loving.
But like, I'm going to say what I see here. Like, for many, many, many years, and in fact, when I look at it, this is how I still see it, and I'm assuming people listening to this will be familiar. If you're not, for some incredible reason, familiar with the test card, all you have to do is look up Tim's book and it's on the front cover. But there's the girl you're discussing. There's a clown's head there. And there's some kind of emerald skull staring at the girl.
It's not Arthur C. Clarke's mysterious
right, but you know what I mean?
world.
I didn't know that was the clown's body. I thought that was
It does look a bit like
a kind of a
wrapped
head.
in crepe paper.
Why is a head kind of boggling at her there? And why is she writing XO to it? It's very strange. But tell us something about it. It was still on. When was this last shown on a British television?
I think it was last in regular use in 97 and 98, but they were still using it into the early 2000s. But that bears. I mean, they still use it in some capacities now.
Do they?
Yeah, mainly for branding. But
so what would that? So I used to go to a second-hand shop, and when I was making my collage stuff, I'd buy these big photographs, and I found out later they were used by the TV news. If they'd say like the news story from Loch Lomond or something, they'd have something the camera could pan across.
Okay.
What is that in real life? How can it be on TV in HD? Was it like, is that an artwork? Is that made on a computer? Like, what is the test card?
it's a huge card. There are photos of various test cards sort of up on easels with, sort of technicians going, hey, next to them.
Sort of like painted by technical
yes, yeah, and then in the
and...
middle there'd be a transparency with the light shone through it. But they didn't all... That was the first one to have a photographic image. And the reason for that being, it's from 1967, and there have been test cards before that, which were basically just, the grid around the outside, but right the way through, with a circle in the middle with more grids in, and... Famously, test card B is missing and nobody knows what it looks like. It's my favourite facts. And also, there was a test card E before. That's test card F. Test card E apparently was shown for a single day and it was withdrawn due to technical reasons. And I like to think some, television, sort of Granada Rentals retailer saw it, went berserk, started attacking the customers.
I've got another question picking up what Michael said. So when I saw on my television as a child the test card, forgive me, was I looking at a live broadcast of a card on an easel?
Yes, essentially, yeah.
No. She was kept in a lab.
I used to think they were actually there behind it.
But it was a camera pointing at a card.
Yes, yeah.
Sorry, we've gone into we've gone
digital file feeding in, is it? It would have to be.
Yeah, it was physical. Yeah. But it's from 1967, and they thought at that point, well, hang on, BBC Two are going to be doing test colour transmissions later in the year. And obviously, only the Beatles had colour TVs at that point, but, there weren't going to be people watching it, and they thought, well, we need something to check that the colour's working as well as, the vertical alignments and the shading and so on. And George Hersey, who was one of the, well, they were called engineers, but, they did the technical drawings and so on, thought of a few ideas for a photograph in the middle, and he just thought, well, if we have an adult in the middle, because there are some sort of prototypes with, sort of 60s women in your area are single now, kind of models pouncing through it, but he thought, but their fashions will change, and children's fashions don't really change. So he's just got his daughter to pose with her own clown toy. That's his daughter, Carol, and I think... in one way he was right, because it did stay in use for years, and the fashion didn't change, but it did make her look creepy from the outset. That's the other thing.
Is she still? Do we know where Carol is today? Not now.
Yeah, she became, I think, a fashion designer, and she did not like being reminded of the test card. There are a couple of photos from, various anniversaries where she's posing clearly very reluctantly for the press. With the one photo I've seen her looking happy in is there was an album BBC Records say called The Girl on the Test Card, which is sort of basically test card music, and she looks quite proud of that. She's holding it up, but otherwise she wasn't keen.
Oh, this is. I
tried to get her for the podcast today, but
I think
I'd love to talk to her, but I imagine she was probably sick of talking about it within weeks, because can you imagine being that age and every day we go to school that people go doo sarcastically as well.
Okay, so talk us through. You write very interestingly in the book about children's programs that were shown at lunchtime and children's programs that were shown just before the news. And I wonder whether you could remind us of some of those, and also say what was the idea? Why was the Magic Roundabout scheduled just before? Was it scheduled just before the 6 o'clock news? Is that right, or have I misremembered?
Yeah. I think it was slightly earlier than 6 when it first began.
Yeah,
I think it was just before 6, but yes, it was the main news bulletin. Yeah.
So what was the thinking in the BBC there? To what? To keep children's programmes going all the way up until the news, or?
Yes, I mean they did anyway before that, but again it was quite an accident really, because they bought the Magic Roundabout without really much thought about what to do with it, because famously when it came to the the original soundtrack, I mean obviously it had to be dubbed, but the original stories just didn't work in English, so they got Eric Thompson, one of the Play School presenters, to just make up what he thought was going on. So he threw in all kinds of references to the Suez Crisis and Bob Dylan and things like that.
Yes, so the rabbit was called Dylan.
Yes,
and Dougal, the dog, who was the star arguably of the Magic Roundabout, I only realised comparatively recently is Eric Thompson doing his Tony Hancock impression.
Yes, yeah,
Isn't it? Stone Me, it's all that
yes,
stuff, right?
absolutely, yeah. And they didn't really know where to put it, but it made more sense to have a buffer against the very definite end to children's television, because that carries on right up until the mid-80s when they changed the structure. I think that's when it became defined as the 6 o'clock news, and you didn't have Nationwide and all the other splintered bits of it, and that changed then, and you'd usually get a whole programme that acted as a buffer, like that sitcom Gloria or Charles in Charge or things like that.
Okay. I was trying to remember this in the recently, back in the 90s, BBC One, you'd sort of like the structure of kids' TV would be all the short programmes and cartoons around 3 and 4 o'clock. 4:30 you'd have Uncle Jack and Operation Green or something that was a bit more of a drama. 10 minutes for news round, and then either Blue Peter or Biker Grove, and then it finished at 5:35. I can never remember what was on at 5:35.
Neighbours.
Yeah, Neighbours.
Neighbours.
Yeah,
of course. I never watched Neighbours.
Yeah, you see, they tried to do different things with that slot, because famously, as I do talk about in the book, there was Fax, which is a very odd show with Bill Oddie, Billy Butler, and rotating third female host.
Billy Butler.
Yeah, answering viewers' questions about trivia that are sent in. So what was the name of the winning goal scorer in whatever year, and then.
It was the internet of its day, Mike.
Wow.
I love bringing out, there was controversy once about somebody wrote in saying how do cash machines know you're you, and Bill Oddie demonstrated how they work live on air, but if you wrote in saying he tapped in my PIN number and drew some money out, Bill Oddie has stolen £5 from me. But they tried a couple of different things, and then Neighbours wound up in that slot and it took over, and that was the end of that really. But before that, there had been that tradition of the 5-minute animation before the news, usually very whimsical, usually made by an independent company, like for example, favourite of both of ours, Ludwig, made by Mirek and Peter Lang, who were a father and son animation team, which is basically about a sort of crystalline alien robot that landed in woodland.
And yes, and I can't remember your exact description of Ludwig in this book, but I know when we did the event with Justin a few weeks ago, Tim minted a way of a sort of portmanteau description of very odd things,
Well-
such as Ludwig, as you say, a diamond, bendy-legged,
Yes.
Beethoven listening,
With a violin attachment.
Very strange.
But that is one thing I want to say about the book, actually, which is, without sort of, I've noticed a couple of comments in various places saying, people saying, oh, it's just a list. Well, it's not, because there are in-depth bits about, for example, the box with lights and so on, but everything that looks like it is listed, I put so much effort in. I spent the whole afternoon working out how to try and get the flavour of how banal Ragdolliana was in half a sentence, because I thought I've got to because that was important, because that marks a turning point in the ITV.
Can you remember what you came up with?
I think there's something about accidental train journey prone doll was part of it, but to the ship round of Pat Coombs.
Well, the thing, Tim, I really admire about the book is you break the story into genres, and then you tend to work backwards. So you will have a chapter on, for the sake of argument, Thunderbirds, and you will then have a chapter about all the things that... No, it's the other way around, isn't it?
Yes.
Yes, sorry, I'm sorry, forgive me. But you will not lead, as it were, with Thunderbirds. You'll talk through the labyrinthine history of puppet shows that lead up to the one that everybody remembers. And then, as a result, which you can sort of explicate why it was so successful. So, the Magic Roundabout, to go back to that, that built up a very loyal viewing audience of adults coming in from work. Indeed, in our house, my dad would get the same train home every day. He would be through the door at the same time every day, which was at about 5:40, and that's the TV programme we shared. Magic Roundabout, that and the wrestling on Saturdays.
Not much crossover between the two.
Missed a trick there, eh? But I wonder with Thunderbirds, let's give people why is Thunderbirds so slow, Tim? An episode of Thunderbirds is really slow if you watch it now. You don't remember it as being slow. Why is it?
I would agree with that, actually, that it is quite slow. The reason being, it's 50 minutes. It's the length of, a detective show or a drama show. Yeah, the reason for that being that all the other Jerry and Sylvia Anderson shows, that's a really important thing, is I've really gone out my way to emphasise Sylvia's involvement in the shows, because it is now being reduced down to Jerry Anderson, which is so unfair. Because whatever people think of, Jerry as the ideas man, so on, Sylvia had an important role in every show. She wrote, she designed characters, she wrote character backgrounds.
She's a vital part of it.
She was the one who could sell things to networks as well.
But why then is Thunderbirds 50 minutes long?
Because, now, I say this with some qualification, because at the moment, Stephen LaRiviere, who is a brilliant researcher of all things Jerry and Sylvia Anderson, is working on some materials he's found from early in production of Thunderbirds, which apparently may, not change the story, but, change the details a bit slightly, because it was never told in a consistent way by anyone.
Oh, God.
Which is
Print the legend,
but,
though, Tim.
Yeah,
Print the legend.
The legend is that they've done it as 25 minutes, like Fireball XO5, like Stingray, like Supercar. They took it to Lou Grays, who was head of ATV, who absolutely loved what they did, although he didn't love the Secret Service, a later show, but that's another story.
I'm going to ask you about that in a minute.
He watched it and jumped out of his chair at the end shouting, fantastic, absolutely fantastic, we've got to make this into an hour for America, which was a sound commercial decision, but I think at least a dozen episodes had already been shot, so they had to go back and add subplots and film extra material.
They tend to solve it. It explains why they tend to solve it by showing 5 minutes of a bit of kit trundling down the runway.
And also, there's always a failed first rescue attempt before they think of calling international rescue.
That's right. Yes, of course. And Thunderbirds comes back, doesn't it? It keeps not so much being revived as being rediscovered and becoming popular again.
I think that's the vehicles, and the mistake they make quite often is messing with the vehicles, because I know Thunderbird 2 looks like something from another age, but you make it more streamlined, you've lost people.
Is that the green one?
The green one,
yeah. That's the best one.
Because people don't care about the Tracy brothers. Can people even name all of them? You know,
I mean,
people even remember John, who was.
Yeah.
Although, if you watch Stuart Lee and Richard Herring shows in the 90s, there was Ian Tracy as well, who was kept in the cupboard that they told was called Thunderbird 6.
I think Thunderbirds as a show benefited greatly from the thing we were talking about earlier, where you would spend a small amount of time watching it and a large amount of time thinking about it.
Yeah,
because like,
really true.
When I was little, do you remember Buster comic?
Yes.
Yeah. I did the Spot the Difference in Buster comic, and I won a videotape of Joe 90, which I was very unhappy to hear the Joe 90 slander at the event the other week. Joe 90 is my favourite show of the bunch. But then, not long after that, there was another Thunderbirds revival on TV, and I always found the show relatively boring, but was super into it because it had the best aesthetic. It had the 5 brothers. One of them lives in space.
The theme music as well.
Like, it's the most fun
Yeah.
to think about and to fantasize about, to play with your friends, blah blah blah. And then when you're watching it, you're just kind of looking at the toys. Do you know what I mean? It's not.
Also, Thunderbirds does a brilliant thing, however deliberately or not, I don't know, but by introducing the 5 main Thunderbirds in the opening credits every time, and mostly only letting you see numbers 1 and 2 in action.
Oh, of course.
Yeah,
Right.
Yeah.
To me, Thunderbird 3 was my favourite Thunderbird.
Mine was Thunderbird 5.
Was
It's never involved in any of the action.
5 is the space station.
Yes, that's
Yeah,
right.
with that
It's
weird
four-
Whistly version.
3 is
Four's
the
on the-
orange rocket.
4's the submarine.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Can't remember 1.
It's the silver rocket.
yeah.
Right.
It's the most boring of the Thunderbirds. It's the mass one.
Right. I did love the submarine. I really liked
Yeah.
the submarine.
But it works within the show because it's almost like you're presenting Thunderbirds 1 and 2 as the main characters. You're always going to get them. And then you might get a sprinkling of
Yeah,
one
it's
of
like
the
Kramer
other Thunderbirds.
or something.
Yeah.
Thunderbird
That's right,
4
yeah,
will just
yeah,
come in the door.
Well,
yeah.
no, I think that is it's interesting you mentioned sci-fi, because I think that's a really clever trick to do with things, because I love sci-fi, but I appreciate it's not children's TV, but I loved particularly the episodes that was about Elaine and Kramer teaming up. And then, I always wondered why that was, but when I listened to one of the commentaries, one of the writers said, I always love doing episodes with Elaine and Kramer because you've got a different dynamic, because they're friends of Jerry, but they're not friends of each other, they don't actually like each other.
Right,
And
okay.
so with Thunderbirds, how do you bring Thunderbird 3 into the action? You can't do it very often.
Yeah, well, what distinguishes it from Thunderbird 1? Thunderbird 1's a rocket, right? And but is Thunderbird 3...
The couch goes up
Space-worthy.
into it to take off
Yeah,
for
I
no
don't know how they
reason. Yeah, that's the difference. Whereas Thunderbird 1, you have to stand against the painting and get flipped over.
That's right. Okay, so I want to ask you in a moment about programmes that were made by departments other than the children's department that were more popular with children. We'll come to that in a minute. But I would be failing in my duty to our earlier conversation with Justin if we didn't talk a little bit about, on the one hand, Thunderbird, the most successful of the Jerry and Sylvia Anderson productions. Let's just talk a little bit about probably the least successful, which was The Secret Service. Can you, in the space of a sentence or two, pitch me the premise of The Secret Service?
As long as I don't have to do it in Unwinnies. That's all I care about. Basically, there is a priest played by Stanley Unwin who undertakes Secret Service missions, which he does by talking in Stanley Unwin's nonsense language, Unwinese, and he can go small.
It is. Have you ever seen it,
There's
Michael?
no puppets in this. It's
Oh, the thing, right?
He turns into a puppet.
What?
It plays tricks with scale and the relationship between the puppet and the human that only LSD is otherwise able to achieve. It's so strange in terms of its. In other words, but what I feel about watching The Secret Service, Tim, is all the lucky accidents that went right in Thunderbirds went wrong in The Secret Service. I
Yes.
love The Secret Service, but
It's my favourite, even though it's not the best. Qualitatively, it's probably not the best, but I absolutely adore the Secret Service, and I think, well, we can say this, Michael's left the room so it's safe, but the problem, I think they were on the downward trajectory because Captain Scarlet had caused problems because of the levels of violence. And
the zombification.
Yeah, I believe there were a couple of years when ITV refused to repeat it. I've never been sure of the veracity of that, but that has been the story. Mm-hmm. But then they did Joe 90, which my problem with that is that it is about a 9-year-old boy who can do things that you can't, and is a little bit smug and clever, and children do not want to watch that. They don't like watching other children doing things. The one good episode I will say that I really love of Joe 90 is the Christmas one, which is sort of modern horror thing set in a church where forgers are pretending there's a ghost to scare people. Why they're doing forging in the church, I don't know. But I think that kind of inspired the Secret Service. But I do wonder, because that went out on Sundays, not in their usual slot, because, it had that sort of churchy theme and slight sort of whimsy that could belong in a Sunday early evening slot. And I think they were trying to, because immediately after, while it's in production, they do the first adult feature film, Doppelganger, which is it gets a lot of stick, but I really like it. It's a very sort of dark, Cold War-inspired sci-fi thriller. And then immediately after the Secret Service do UFO, they were gearing up, they were trying to do something a bit more, with a little more adult appeal, I think, with the Secret Service.
What year is the Secret Service made? Not broadcast, made.
Mostly 1968 into 69.
So my interpretation, let me give you mine.
And also it gets pulled halfway through by Lou Graham, we can't sell this to America.
Right, okay, so my interpretation of the Secret Service is, it's pure speculation, but I'm assuming that the Andersons were looking at one of the most popular shows in the UK and in America, The Avengers.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah. So they're looking at the Avengers and thinking, okay, being British is very fashionable at the moment. A slightly surreal, slightly whimsical adventure series. We can pitch that. And then of course Lou Gray pulls the plug because they can't sell it in America. Is that fair?
I think that's absolutely true. And I think another problem with it that I think maybe people don't appreciate it's the same as, I'll be careful how I phrase this, but Stanley Unwin narrates the Small Faces album Ogden's Nut Gone Flake. And I know a number of people who love the Small Faces who say, I've never really been interested in it. I don't find those bits quite irritating. And I think the problem is that Stanley Unwin's humour relied on him talking about mundane concepts in a gibberish fashion. That album he did, Rotated Discos with Unwin, where he does fairy stories in Babel, and that bit where he talks about how to set up your record player, which has me in stitches, when he talks about Elvis and so on. That's really funny. But if he's talking about something fantastical, it doesn't work as well. The bits of Unwin are kind of the least interesting aspect of the Secret Service.
You would have to say, in terms of creating any sense of drama or tension, it probably militates against that, doesn't it? Just on the basic level, yeah. Okay, so before we wind up, let's talk about this fascinating subgenre of TV show, which I guess comes right through to today. Shows for adults that catch on with children. Now, I remember people in the playground wanting to play Starsky and Hutch or The Professionals, which when you watch The Professionals now is mind-boggling that children were allowed to stay up and watch it. You know what I mean, right?
Yeah.
There's always that sense that a show has really taken off if children adopt it. I wonder what shows you think particularly stand out over the years as adult shows which are so loved by children that we might forget they're adult shows.
It's difficult to say because the one people always go for is the young ones, and I don't think, I'm sorry, children love that, but nobody under any circumstances could mistake that for a children's show in any way. It was always an adult show.
That's fair,
but
yeah.
I think the Goodies is the big one, really, because one observation I always make about the Goodies, because people forget this, is that it started as a late night BBC Two show, which came out of another late night BBC Two show which came out of a radio show. So it had its origins as something that was very much for an adult audience, and it was initially aimed at, I think, sort of, heads taking care not to spill the bong water.
Okay, was it?
Series
So
1 is very different.
So it was more at the Bill Oddie end of things than the Tim Brooke Taylor end of things.
Much more directly satirical, I'd say, in terms of, in Series 1 you got that brilliant one about the pirate radio stations being outlawed, where they set up a pirate post office outside.
They've only got one record, haven't they?
Yes.
They're going to walk in the Black Forest. See, I can remember, I haven't seen that for 30, 40 years,
But children latch onto that, and it becomes more... I don't think it ever becomes a children's show, but it becomes more something that's for the family later on.
Certainly.
And I think people forget its roots.
I have a very vivid memory of watching... I don't think I'd seen the Goodies before the Goodies and the Beanstalk TV special, and I have an incredibly vivid memory of watching that. Now, at that point that is a children's show. I mean, it's a pantomime, right?
Yeah.
A hip pantomime, which brings in the magic roundabout, in fact.
Yes.
But what about Doctor Who? Is Doctor Who, let's ask you the thorny question, is Doctor Who a children's programme? Yes or no?
No, it's not an adults programme either, though. I don't buy into the very... Doctor Who fans are very big on protectiveness about the object of their affection, but I think it was... If you look at the origins of it, the slot it came into, the shows that people forget, there were programmes in that slot before Doctor Who, and they were always sort of family adventure things like Gary Halliday, which I think next to nothing exists of, which is about a retired flying ace who, goes on to solve crimes in his spare time. And, it was an established genre, and the two reasons that I don't really cover Doctor Who in there are, A, while it wasn't a children's programme, it didn't quite fit into the chapter of designated that's not a children's programme either.
Right.
It fell between the two, and I just decided there's been enough written about Doctor Who over the years, including by me, so, I thought I can talk about things that nobody's mentioned in decades instead of mentioning that. The other reason... Well, actually, no, that was both of my reasons in one, actually, but the only programme I regret leaving out for that reason was I decided that variety shows that, the big one being Top of the Pops had a huge appeal, but they do not have a part to play in the story of children's TV other than the Checkers Plays Pop was, the kids or Razzmatazz. And the one I regret leaving out because I just didn't think it warranted being called a children's show was Pinky and Perky, because that was, a light entertainment show in, the family.
It's not made by the children's department.
No, absolutely not. But I did think, well, nobody's picked up on it yet, but surely those two pigs deserve some kind of a mention in there. So that's the one thing I'd go back and change, actually, to have more pigs singing Beatles songs.
Okay, well, listen, we're nearly out of time. Let me ask you one more question. Obviously, we would love people to buy, borrow, and read your book. What was the show you felt most keen to let people know about in your book that they might not otherwise have encountered?
I would have to say... I mean, there's quite a few to choose from, so I'm trying to whittle it down.
Give us three. I mean, I like to think I know a lot about this subject. I don't think I know as much as you do, Tim, clearly. But when I was reading it, I was constantly educated and entertained. In fact, your Reithian values are in place.
The word educated is opposite, because one of them would say, and I was surprised I was allowed to do this as the focused show in the section on comedy, because, there are bigger children's comedy shows than this, but Marmalade Atkins, as in Educated Marmalade,
love Marmalade
Danger
Atkins.
Marmalade at Work, I think was a really important show at its time, that had its time. Don't get me wrong, I'm not one of those people that waves my fist and says, why won't today's children watch Marmalade Atkins?
And when was Marmalade Atkins broadcast and where?
Children's ITV, 1981, 82, 83-ish.
Yeah, and it was written by...
Andrew Davis, who
went on
obviously
to write a very
peculiar practice, amongst other things. Yeah, and I just felt that was really, it deserved its storytelling, because it did feel like, I mean, you know, we say there's the shows like The Young Ones that, you know, children wanted to watch when life. This was alternative comedy for kids. It was, you know, the world's naughtiest, most rebellious schoolgirl, with some of the, you know, obviously not Rick and Ada or Alexis Sale, but with some of the people from the early alternative comedy scene were in it, playing roles in it. And so there's that. There's also, I think Pipkins has fallen off the radar a bit, and that was an incredible show that it really did.
Yes.
It was about a toy maker and some of his puppets who, for reasons unexplained, were sentient, but they were aware that they were in a TV show. And what always stayed with me is, I remember watching the very last one when ATV lost their franchise and replaced by Central for that ITV region. And it ends with the puppets basically turning to the camera and saying, well, we won't be here next week. And Hartley Hare says there'll be a new programme with new people. And for a show to have been doing that at that point, I think it's Rainbow people mention, and Rainbow.
It's just not fair.
Yes, But Rainbow to talk about is a little bit boring, whereas Pipkins.
Okay, yeah.
You know, there's a lot. And a third one, I'm going to say King of the Castle, which is one of the spooky 70s folk horror shows that never gets mentioned. People always mention Children of the Stones, which is great, but King of the Castle, is very odd, because it's about a public school boy who, his family changed circumstances, he has to live in a tower block and go to the local comp.
Yeah.
And he somehow, in the tower block, ends up... there is a myth out there that it turned out to all be a dream. The lift goes too far down. He comes out in the basement full of weird sort of Tolkien-esque analogues, or, you know, half Tolkien, half Lewis Carroll, of the malevolent forces in his life, you know, like the school bully and the sadistic teacher, and he has to outsmart them all to get to the end of... Basically, it's kind of like a Dungeons and Dragons in real life.
That? Who wrote that? Can you remember?
That was Bob Baker and Dave Martin. They wrote a lot of the best Doctor Who stories from around that time.
Absolutely. Okay, so I'm going to throw in two programmes that I remember. I can't recall if you mentioned them in the book, but there's one whose title has now escapes me, but it was an ITV show, late 70s, early 80s. It was set in a dystopian future where food rationing was...
That was Castle. That is.
Oh my God. That is a disturbing show. I remember that. I remember the kids, the youngsters, going into pubs, and in the pubs, punks were listening to punk rock, right? And thinking, I don't want to grow up. So actually, in fact, Grange Hill made me think, I don't want to go to school.
Yeah.
You know, the constant terror, right?
It was incredible what a malevolent force punks were in children's programmes as well.
Also, do you remember a series called Latchkey Kids?
I do, yes, when they wanted to stop a tree being knocked down on their estate,
But that's, you see, what's so interesting is that strikes me as all those programmes, very late 70s, early 80s, right? So if you go from, say, the early 70s, where you have, I don't know, a handful of songs, right? And all this, it's made by students who grew up listening to folk music, and they wear they've got long hair and wear brown clothes. By the time you get to the late 70s and early 80s, it's young people who've come up through punk and alternative TV,
Have you ever
right?
seen Four Idle Hands? Which is I think it's 76 or 77. It's a very young Phil Daniels and Ray Burdis, as when say they're school leavers, they get kicked out of school, and it's about, they're kind of like, you know, Phil Daniels go, we don't want a life on the dole, do we? Let's go and look for work. And each week they try a different job that they're useless at, with a social worker who's very much on their side. You know, so you try, boys. Let's try another thing. And it's odd because it's got that real sort of dystopian air, but there's a lot of hope in it as well. Whereas a lot of the others, there is no hope in.
I was going to say, you know. Anyway, listen, Tim, thank you so much for your time and your generosity, and Michael, thank you for giving us an opportunity to get this recorded this time.
Absolutely, my pleasure. If I can just put on my corporate hat and remind listeners that the golden age of children's TV is available from deadinkbookshop.com and the Dead Ink Bookshop on Smithdown Road. Signed copies, I believe. Tim's going to sign some today.
And if I could just add a very quick plug for my own podcast, Backlisted, where we've just recorded an episode with former Doctor Who showrunner Chris Chibnall.
Really?
Really?
Yes. Drop that in, you've heard that.
I didn't know this was
You've
Chris
heard
was on
that.
Blue Sky.
You've heard that here
He's
first.
written a book, hasn't he?
He has.
Right,
yeah.
right. And he's adapting it for TV?
And he grew up, he lived up here for a while.
I met a long time ago. I used to know Chris from the local Doctor Who group.
There you go.
So,
Wow.
So
Wow.
anyway, Chris was when we finish recording this, I'm going to tell these two a thing that Chris told me about his time on Doctor Who, which will break the internet when it comes out. So make sure you listen to that episode of Backlisted, everybody. But Tim, thank you so much. We love the book, and I cannot recommend it highly enough.
well, thank you both.
Cheers. Thanks, everyone.